Imagine trying to solve this massive puzzle, but like most of the pieces are just hidden.
Yeah.
For centuries, that's basically what it was like trying to figure out how life on Earth changes. Creatures appear, they diversify, they vanish. This whole grand spectacle, but with no clear how or why.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it. Even without all the detailed knowledge we have now, people back then, early thinkers, they recognized that life wasn't static.
Exactly.
They saw patterns. They started suggesting, maybe species could actually transform over these huge timescales.
Absolutely. And, well, one of the really key figures in that early exploration was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He made some sharp observations, actually, about the natural world. And he proposed a really interesting mechanism for how these changes might happen. So our mission today for this deep dive is to really get a solid handle on Lamarck's thinking.
Right.
Understand why his ideas didn't, ultimately stick, and then see how Darwin sort of built on that foundation to develop his completely groundbreaking theory of natural selection.
It's a great story of how science itself evolves, really.
Huh. Yeah, pun intended. It really underscores that science is this dynamic process, right? Proposing ideas, testing them, refining them.
Constantly refining our explanations of the world. Yeah. This historical view is so important.
Okay, so let's dive into the core of Lamarck's theory then. His main idea, the one everyone kind of remembers, is the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which in some ways feels quite intuitive, doesn't it? He basically proposed that if an organism developed a specific trait during its life, say, by using a body part, more or less,
then that change, that acquired trait, could be passed down to its kids.
Exactly.
He saw how incredibly well-suited organisms were to their environments, and his logic was, well, this adaptation must happen through some direct interaction between the creature and its surroundings.
And those changes become heritable.
Right, allowing the next generation to be even better equipped for that same environment.
The classic example, the one everyone uses to explain this, is the giraffe.
Yes, the giraffe's neck.
Lamarck theorized that ancestral giraffes, the ones with shorter necks, were constantly stretching, reaching for those higher leaves, the ones maybe other animals couldn't get to.
And this repeated effort, the constant stretching.
In his view, that would actually make the neck slightly longer in that individual giraffe's lifetime.
And here's the crucial part of his theory.
That slightly longer neck, acquired through effort, would then be inherited by its offspring,
who would then stretch their necks and so on, leading to this gradual increase in neck length over many, many generations.
The underlying principle he proposed was about use and disuse.
Exactly. He thought, increased use of an organ or a body part would strengthen it, enlarge it, kind of like how our muscles grow if we exercise them a lot.
Makes sense.
And conversely, if you didn't use a part, it would weaken, shrink, maybe even disappear over time.
And these changes, the ones acquired during the parent's life, were somehow transferred.
Transferred to their reproductive cells somehow and then passed on. He observed the changes, the adaptations clearly, but the actual biological mechanism for how that transfer happened wasn't understood back then. He didn't have the tools for that.
Okay, so on the surface, like we said, it has a certain logic. We see changes in our own bodies based on how we use them.
Right.
But this is where it gets really interesting, because the scientific community started to, test these ideas with experiments.
And one experiment that became quite famous, or maybe infamous, was designed specifically to test this Lamarckian idea. It involved mice.
Mice, yes, and their tails.
Yeah.
A rather persistent study.
You could say that.
Scientists repeatedly cut the tails off mice.
Yeah.
For multiple generations.
Yeah.
Now, if Lamarck was right,
then you expect the offspring, generation after generation, to show some effect, right?
Yeah. Since the parents weren't using their full tails, the prediction would be a gradual shrinking, shorter tails in the descendants.
The idea was that this acquired trait, the lack of a full tail due to cutting, would become sort of encoded, passed on. So eventually maybe mice would be born with tiny tails or none at all.
That would have been direct, observable proof of acquired characteristics being inherited.
A clear win for Lamarck's hypothesis.
Well, that's absolutely not what they found.
No. Generation after generation, the baby mice were born with perfectly normal, full-length tails.
Despite their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents all having their tails removed.
The offspring just kept developing full tails. It didn't stick.
So this experiment, And, okay, maybe the ethics are a bit questionable by today's standards.
Definitely.
But scientifically, it delivered a pretty significant blow to Lamarck's idea.
It strongly suggested that changes happening to an organism during its life aren't automatically passed down. Inheritance seemed to work differently.
And this finding, plus, critically, the rise of classical genetics later on,
Right, in the early 20th century.
which gave us a completely different, much more detailed picture of how traits are actually inherited.
Well, that really led to the decline of Lamarck's theory as the main explanation for evolution.
Exactly. Mendelian genetics, understanding genes and how they're passed on, offered a much more robust, testable framework.
A framework that just didn't support the inheritance of acquired characteristics.
Precisely. The focus shifted to genes as the units of heredity.
Which brings us then to Charles Darwin. Now he, like Lamarck, absolutely recognized that species change over time. That was a key agreement.
He saw the evidence for evolution too, but his explanation for the mechanism, for how it happened, was radically different.
Revolutionary, really.
Darwin's huge contribution was, of course, the theory of natural selection.
So instead of changes acquired during life being the driver,
He shifted the focus entirely. He looked at the variation that already exists within any population, naturally occurring differences.
okay, let's go back to the giraffes again, but look through Darwin's lens this time. So from a Darwinian perspective, in that ancestral giraffe population, you just naturally had variation in neck length,
Right. Some were just born with slightly longer necks, some with slightly shorter ones.
all due to random inherited genetic differences. Nothing to do with stretching.
This variation is just there. It's pre-existing. That's the crucial distinction.
Exactly. It arises through the genetic lottery, essentially, during reproduction, not lifetime effort.
Okay, so you've got this variation. Now, here comes the selection part.
Right. Those giraffes that happened to be born with naturally longer necks, they had an edge, a significant advantage.
Because they could reach more food, those higher leaves, especially maybe when food was scarce lower down.
Exactly. Better access to resources meant they were more likely to survive longer, be healthier,
And reproduce more successfully.
and crucially, pass on their genes, including the genes that contributed to having a longer neck.
Meanwhile, the giraffes born with shorter necks.
They had a tougher time. Less food, maybe lower survival rates, fewer chances to reproduce and pass on their genes for shorter necks.
So it's this difference in survival and reproduction, based entirely on the traits they inherited.
That is the absolute core of natural selection. Differential reproductive success driven by inherited variation.
So, over time, and we're talking many, many generations,
A very long time. Yeah.
this constant process nature, the environment, selecting individuals with traits that give them an advantage, leads to those advantageous traits becoming more and more common in the population.
And that's why we see giraffes today with these incredibly long necks. It wasn't the stretching effort of their ancestors being passed down.
It was because the ones born with slightly longer necks, generation after generation, were simply more successful. They outcompeted the shorter-necked ones.
And their long neck genes became dominant. Darwin laid all this out meticulously, of course, in his famous book.
Two main theories really stand out, don't they?
Yes. First, the big picture. That all current plants and animals descended from earlier, more primitive species through this process of evolution. He called it descent with modification.
Descent with modification. Okay? And the second key theory, the mechanism.
The mechanism is natural selection. That's the driving force. Organisms that happen to possess traits better suited to their particular environment
Their specific surroundings.
are just more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce, and therefore more likely to pass those helpful traits to their own offspring.
It's really about who's best equipped for the current conditions. They leave more descendants.
Essentially, yes, it's a filtering process acting on existing variation.
So, okay, let's really nail down the core difference one more time. Lamarck thought.
Lamarck thought an individual could acquire a trait like a stretched neck during its lifetime and pass that specific acquired change directly to its offspring.
Right. Whereas Darwin showed
The variation is already there in the population, just naturally occurring. And the environment acts as a filter, selecting which of those pre-existing variations are most advantageous for survival and reproduction.
leading to gradual change in the whole population over vast stretches of time.
Exactly. And then later on, our understanding of genetics came along and provided massive support for Darwin's framework.
They gave us the mechanism Darwin didn't fully have.
Precisely. Genes are inherited. Natural selection acts on the variations caused by different gene combinations. Acquired characteristics generally don't change the underlying genetic code that gets passed on.
Wow. This journey through the early days of evolutionary thought, it's really quite something, seeing how scientific ideas themselves develop and change.
It really is. Observation, hypothesis, testing, refinement, the process in action.
So here's something for you listening to think about. How does understanding this history, from those first inklings that life wasn't fixed, through Lamarck to Darwin's powerful explanation, how did that shape the way you look at the sheer diversity of life we see all around us today?
Yeah, and maybe think about what present-day examples you can see where natural selection is clearly still at work shaping life right now.